May 10, 2000. Lungi Airport, Sierra Leone. The Chinook helicopter settled onto cracked tarmac that radiated heat like an oven plate. 26 men in tropical DPM stepped out into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through wet cloth. They carried Bergen rucksacks that weighed nearly 40 kilos each, SA-80 rifles, and orders that made absolutely no sense given their numbers. These were D Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment, the best close-quarter battle specialists in the British military. Men who had spent careers perfecting the art of surgical raids, hostage rescue, and surgical violence, delivered with scalpel precision. They had been pulled from counter-terrorism standby in Hereford 18 hours earlier, flown through the night on a C-130, and dropped into the middle of a civil war that had already consumed 50,000 lives over 9 years. Their mission brief had been delivered in the cramped passenger hold somewhere over the Sahara. Secure the airport. Prepare for potential non-combatant evacuation. Do not, under any circumstances, engage rebel forces unless directly threatened. Defensive posture only. London was being very clear about that last part. This was not a combat deployment. Britain had neither the political will nor the legal authority to intervene in Sierra Leone's internal conflict. The SAS were there to babysit an evacuation if it became necessary, nothing more. What London did not understand, and what those 26 men were about to discover in the most violent way possible, was that sometimes defensive posture is not an option. Sometimes the enemy decides for you, and sometimes 6 hours of controlled fury can accomplish what 9 years of half measures could not. Within 72 hours, the Revolutionary United Front, the REF, a rebel army that had terrorized Sierra Leone since 1991, would suffer casualties that shattered their operational capability. Their most feared commander would be dead. Their siege of the capital would collapse. And the war that had consumed a nation would effectively end not through negotiation or gradual attrition, but through a single concentrated application of violence, so overwhelming that the RUF never recovered. The men stepping off that Chinook had no idea they were about to fight the battle that would become legend within the regiment. The battle that SAS instructors still teach as the textbook example of what happens when elite soldiers are forced to abandon restraint. The battle that ended a war in less time than it takes most units to complete a planning cycle. But first, they had to survive the next 6 hours. And first, you need to understand how Sierra Leone became the place where wars went to die slowly. To understand what the SAS walked into in May 2000, you must first understand what Sierra Leone had become following 9 years of civil war that made rational sense to absolutely no one outside the country, and precious few inside it. The Revolutionary United Front began operations in 1991 with rhetoric about liberation and justice. Within months, they had revealed their true nature. The RUF did not fight to win territory or political concessions. They fought to terrorize. Their signature tactic, if you can call sadistic brutality a tactic, was amputation. Civilians, including children, had their hands, arms, or legs hacked off with machetes as punishment for supporting the government, or sometimes for no reason at all beyond the demonstration of power through horror. By 2000, an estimated 20,000 civilians had been mutilated. Refugee camps across West Africa held thousands of amputees, living evidence of a war prosecuted not against soldiers, but against the concept of civil society itself. The RUF wanted diamonds, the small alluvial stones that Sierra Leone's rivers produced in abundance and that could be smuggled across borders to fund weapons purchases. Terror kept the population too frightened to resist. Amputation served as both punishment and advertisement. The government of Sierra Leone, led by President Ahmad Tejan Kaba, barely qualified as functional. The National Army, the Republic of Sierra Leone military forces, had a desertion rate that exceeded recruitment. Soldiers melted away into the interior or switched sides to join the rebels when circumstances suited them. The acronym RSLMF became a bitter joke among civilians. They called them, "Bastards scare me for I run." Into this vacuum stepped multiple forces, each with their own agendas. The Economic Community of West African States deployed ECOMOG, a multinational peacekeeping force led by Nigerian troops. ECOMOG fought bravely, but was chronically under-resourced, under-equipped, and hemorrhaging casualties to ambushes that the RUF executed with cruel efficiency. Private military contractors, including the South African firm Executive Outcomes, provided highly effective combat support for several years until political pressure forced their withdrawal in 1997. When they left, the military situation collapsed almost immediately. The UN established UNAMSIL, the UN mission in Sierra Leone, in 1999 with a mandate to monitor a ceasefire that existed only on paper. By May 2000, UNAMMCIL had approximately 9,000 troops in country, mostly from India, Kenya, and Zambia. These were soldiers sent to keep a peace that did not exist, armed with rules of engagement so restrictive they could barely defend themselves, let alone the civilians they were meant to protect. The RUF understood this perfectly. In early May 2000, they began taking UN peacekeepers hostage, not in ones and twos, but by the hundreds. Entire units surrendered their weapons and were marched into the bush. By May 8, over 500 UN soldiers were held captive, their white vehicles and blue helmets scattered across rebel-held territory like trophies. The hostage-taking had a strategic purpose. The RUF leader, Fode Sanko, believed he could leverage captured peacekeepers into political concessions, perhaps even force the government to include the RUF in a power-sharing arrangement. He had miscalculated before and survived. He believed he could miscalculate again. Britain had interests in Sierra Leone that stretched back to the colonial period. Freetown, the capital, had been founded as a haven for freed slaves in the 18th century. English was the official language. Ties of history, if not always affection, bound the two nations. When the hostage crisis exploded in early May, roughly 500 British citizens and entitled persons, aid workers, teachers, business people, and their families were scattered across Freetown and the surrounding areas. The Foreign Office made the decision quickly. Evacuate them. Get them out before the RUF decided British nationals made useful hostages too. On May 6th, a parachute regiment Pathfinder platoon flew into Lungi Airport to secure the evacuation point. The plan was simple. Fly in, set up a perimeter, coordinate helicopter lifets from Freetown across the harbour to the airport, and get everyone out within 48 hours. But the Pathfinders immediately sent back reports that changed everything. The situation on the ground was deteriorating faster than London had understood. The RUF were advancing toward Freetown. UNAMSIL forces were collapsing. The airport itself was vulnerable. If the RUF decided to overrun Lungi, the evacuation would turn into a hostage situation multiplied by hundreds. That was when the call went to Hereford. D Squadron, on counter-terrorism rotation, received orders to deploy immediately, reinforce the Pathfinders, secure the airport, prepare for a fighting evacuation, if necessary. The mission brief emphasized one thing above all. This is not a combat operation. You are there to protect British lives, not to engage in someone else's civil war. 26 men, one squadron, against a rebel army that numbered in the thousands and had spent 9 years learning to fight dirty in terrain they owned completely. The SAS had operated in worse conditions. They had fought in Malaya, in Borneo, in Oman, in the Falklands, in Iraq. They were accustomed to being outnumbered. But this mission carried a political complexity that made tactical planning almost impossible. Engage only if directly threatened. But how do you define direct threat when the enemy is advancing on your position and you're responsible for hundreds of civilians who cannot defend themselves? Major Andy Harrison, the squadron commander, understood the reality immediately. The rules of engagement were written by people who were not here. The moment the RUF decided to test British resolve, those rules would become irrelevant. The only question was whether London would back them when it happened. Because it was going to happen, everyone on the ground knew it. The RUF had momentum, they had numbers, and they had spent 9 years believing that the international community would never actually fight them. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. At first, there was work to do, perimeters to establish, fields of fire to map, civilians to account for. The regiment had a saying, perfected over decades of operations in places where plans fell apart the moment contact was made. Train hard, fight easy. D Squadron had trained harder than most soldiers could imagine. In the next 72 hours, they would discover whether that training was enough. The first 48 hours at Lungi Airport passed in a controlled chaos that was utterly normal for the regiment. Defensive positions went up with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same job in a dozen different countries, under a dozen different flags. Sangars built from whatever materials were available. Crew served weapons positioned to cover the most likely approaches. Arcs of fire overlapping so that nothing could reach the terminal building without passing through interlocking kill zones. The Pathfinders who had arrived days earlier were good soldiers, fit, aggressive, and well-trained. But they watched the SAS work with something approaching awe. One sergeant later described it in an interview. Everything they did was economy of movement. No wasted effort, no second-guessing. They moved like they had done this 1,000 times before, because they had. The civilians began arriving in waves. Helicopters ferried them across the estuary from Freetown, landing in clouds of red dust that coated everything and everyone. British passport holders, entitled persons from Commonwealth nations, aid workers from a dozen NGOs, teachers who had been trying to rebuild a school system that barely existed. They came, carrying suitcases, children, and the haunted expressions of people who had stayed too long in a place that was collapsing. The SAS treated them with a professional kindness that surprised some of the evacuees. These were men whose job description included close-quarter battle and high-risk hostage rescue, skills that required a certain comfort with violence. But they helped elderly women onto helicopters. They entertained frightened children with quiet jokes. They moved through the crowd with a calm that was more reassuring than any words could have been. By May 12th, most of the evacuation was complete. Over 300 civilians had been flown out. The mission, by any reasonable metric, had succeeded. London was pleased. The Foreign Office congratulated itself on a textbook non-combatant evacuation operation. Orders came through. Prepare to withdraw. Job done. And that was when everything went wrong. 20 kilometers east of Lungi, in the town of Masiaka, a unit of the Royal Irish Regiment was operating as part of UNA Missile. They were training Sierra Leone army soldiers, trying to build something resembling a functional military out of men who had been running away from the RUF for the better part of a decade. The Royal Irish were professionals, but they were lightly armed and operating under UN rules of engagement that made aggressive action nearly impossible. On the morning of May 25th, the RUF attacked. It was not a probe. It was not a skirmish. It was a deliberate assault by a force estimated at 200 to 300 fighters, many of them teenagers high on locally distilled alcohol and whatever amphetamines they could get their hands on. They called themselves the West Side Boys, a splinter faction of the RUF with a reputation for brutality that made even other rebels nervous. The Royal Irish fell back under fire. They radioed for support. UNAMSIL commanders dithered. The rules of engagement required authorization from New York for offensive action. The requests went up the chain of command and disappeared into the kind of bureaucratic paralysis that gets soldiers killed. 11 men from the Royal Irish Regiment along with their Sierra Leone Army liaison officer, were cut off, surrounded, taken. The news reached Lungi Airport within hours. Major Harrison received it with the kind of cold clarity that separates good officers from great ones. 11 British soldiers were in the hands of an enemy that had spent 9 years demonstrating what they did to prisoners. The UN was not going to act. London was 5,000 kilometers away debating legalities. D Squadron was 20 kilometers from the hostages. And the mission brief that said defensive posture only had just become irrelevant. Harrison made the call. They were going in. What happened next would become one of the most studied operations in modern Special Forces history. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the longest, but because it demonstrated what happens when elite soldiers are given a clear objective, the authority to act, and the freedom to apply their training without political interference. The planning took 6 hours. In conventional military operations, a hostage rescue of this complexity would require days of preparation, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, coordination with supporting elements, rehearsals, risk assessments, approval from multiple levels of command. The SAS did it in an effeter known. Intelligence came from multiple sources. UNAMSISIL had aerial imagery, though it was outdated. Pathfinders had contacts among the local population who knew Masiaka and the surrounding area. The Sierra Leone Army liaison provided what information he could about RUF positions, though much of it was little better than guesswork. The plan that emerged was classic SAS, fast, violent, and utterly uncompromising. 2 Chinook helicopters would insert the assault force directly into Masiaka. No preliminary bombardment, no sofitening up, just 26 men hitting the objective with maximum surprise and overwhelming firepower. Get in, locate the hostages, extract them, and get out before the RUF could organize a coherent response. The risk was enormous. If the Chinooks were shot down on approach, the entire squadron would be lost. If the hostages had been moved, the mission would fail, and D Squadron would be deep inside enemy territory with no support. If the RUF managed to kill the hostages before the assault force could reach them, the operation would be a political disaster that would haunt the regiment for decades. Harrison briefed his men with the kind of economy that comes from mutual trust built over years. No speeches, no motivational talks, just facts. 11 men are being held 20 kilometers from here. We're getting them out. Questions? There were no questions. The Chinooks left it off from Lungi at 0600 hours on May 25th. The flight time was less than 15 minutes. The door gunners scanned the jungle canopy below, looking for muzzle flashes that would indicate the RUF had detected them. The troop commanders checked their men one last time. Weapons loaded, radios checked. Everyone knew their role. The helicopters came in low and fast over Masiaka, flaring hard to bleed off speed before touching down in a clearing 200 meters from the suspected hostage location. The rear ramps dropped before the wheels hit the ground. 26 men poured out in a controlled flood, fanning into assault positions with a speed that shocked the RUF fighters who saw them coming. The first contact came within seconds. An RFUF sentry raised his AK-47. He managed one shot before a 3-round burst from an SA-80 dropped him. The entire assault force opened up. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration of what close-quarter battle looks like when executed by men who have trained for nothing else. The SAS moved through Masiaka in pairs, clearing buildings with a methodical violence that gave the RUF no time to respond. Doors were blown open with frame charges. Rooms were cleared in seconds. Anyone armed was engaged immediately. Anyone armed was bypassed. The noise was deafening. SA-80 rifles cracked in short, controlled bursts. The heavier thump of GPMGs, general-purpose machine guns, laid down suppressing fire. The occasional whoosh of a 66 mmLAL rocket as SAS troopers took out hardened positions. And underneath it all, the screaming RUF fighters, shouting to each other, trying to organize, trying to understand what was happening. They never got the chance. Trooper Brad Tinian was the point man for his four-man team. He moved through the town with his rifle up, scanning, acquiring, engaging. In a narrow alley between two corrugated metal buildings, he encountered three rough fighters who had been trying to flank the assault force. Tinian engaged all three before any of them could fire. Later, his team sergeant would describe it in the flat, matter-of-fact tone the regiment uses for such things. Brad didn't hesitate. He saw the threat. He dealt with it. We kept moving. The hostages were found in a compound near the center of town. 11 men bound with rope and guarded by 6 rough fighters who had no idea what was happening outside until the door exploded inward. The SAS team that hit the compound moved with surgical precision. 2 guards were killed in the first seconds. The other 4 dropped their weapons and raised their hands. They were zip-tied and left feet for the follow-on force. The Royal Irish soldiers were pulled to their feet, cut free, and moved toward the extraction point at a run. Some of them were injured. All of them were disoriented. None of them could quite process what had just happened. One moment, they were waiting to be executed, or worse. The next, SAS troopers were dragging them toward helicopters that had materialized out of nowhere. The entire assault, from boots on the ground to hostages secured, took less than 20 minutes. But the mission was not over. The Chinooks were exposed on the ground, and the rough were beginning to recover from the shock. Fighters were converging on the extraction point from multiple directions. If the helicopters were destroyed, the entire force would be stranded. That was when the regiment's training in fire and movement, perfected over decades in jungles from Malaya to Borneo to Belize, proved its worth. Half the assault force provided covering fire, while the other half moved the hostages onto the Chinooks. The GPMGs hammered out long bursts that forced the rough to keep their heads down. 66 rockets turned buildings into rubble. The SAS were not trying to kill every enemy fighter in Masiaka. They were creating enough chaos and firepower to buy the seconds they needed. The hostages were loaded. The assault force collapsed back onto the helicopters in stages, the last men sprinting up the ramps as the pilots spooled up the engines. Rounds snapped through the air. Bullets punched holes in the Chinook fuselages, but the helicopters lifered it off, banked hard, and accelerated away from Masiaka, trailing smoke from hits to non-critical systems. 20 minutes on the ground, 11 hostages recovered, and the RUF had just learned what it meant to fight soldiers who did not care about UN mandates or political sensitivities or the international norms of peacekeeping. They had learned what the SAS had been teaching enemies for 60 years. If you take our people, we will come for them, and we will not stop until we get them back, or you are dead. The war was not over yet, but the balance had just shifted in a way the RUF could not recover from. Just a quick moment. Thank you for spending your time with me. If you've enjoyed this story and you'd like more like it, please subscribe to Saber Squad. It genuinely helps the channel, and it keeps these accounts alive. Right, let's carry on. The rescue of the Royal Irish Regiment sent shockwaves through Freetown and beyond. For 9 years, the RUF had operated with near impunity. They had terrorized civilians, ambushed government forces, and humiliated UN peacekeepers. They had built a reputation as an enemy that could not be beaten by conventional means, because they did not fight conventionally. They disappeared into the bush. They struck from ambush. They melted away before superior forces could bring firepower to bear. The SAS had just proven that reputation was a lie. The RUF could be found, they could be fixed in place, and they could be destroyed. Within 24 hours of the Masiaka raid, the political landscape in London shifted. The operation had been a success beyond anyone's expectations. No British casualties, 11 hostages recovered. The RUF humiliated, Prime Minister Tony Blair, who had been cautious about deeper involvement in Sierra Leone, suddenly saw an opportunity. The international community had failed. The UN had failed. But British forces, operating with clear objectives and the freedom to act, had succeeded decisively. The decision was made to expand the mission, not a full-scale invasion. Britain did not have the political will or the military resources for that, but a targeted campaign to break the RUF's operational capability, train the Sierra Leone army into something resembling a functional force, secure Freetown and the surrounding areas, and make it clear to Foday Sankoh and his commanders that the days of consequence-free terror were over. D Squadron remained in country. They were joined by additional elements from the Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines, and supporting units. But the SAS would remain the tip of the spear, the unit that went into the places where conventional forces could not or would not go. The operations that followed over the next weeks became a masterclass in what the regiment calls offensive action. Small teams inserted deep into rough-held territory, not to hold ground, but to find and kill commanders, to destroy supply caches, to disrupt communications, to create a level of chaos and fear that the RUF had spent 9 years inflicting on others. One operation in particular sent a message that the RUF could not ignore. Intelligence identified the location of a senior RUF commander known as Colonel Savage, a man responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. He was operating from a compound in the interior, surrounded by fighters who believed the jungle made them untouchable. An 8-man SAS patrol inserted by helicopter 10 kilometers from the target. They moved through primary forest for 2 days, covering ground at the agonizingly slow pace that made them invisible. They established an observation post within 50 meters of the compound and waited. For 36 hours, they watched, noting patterns, identifying guards, mapping the compound's layout. The assault came at 0400 hours. The patrol moved in silence to the edge of the compound perimeter. Frame charges blew the doors simultaneously. The assault was over in under 3 minutes. Colonel Savage and 6 of his fighters were killed. Documents and intelligence materials were recovered. The patrol extracted on foot, moving through terrain where any pursuit would have to follow trails the SAS could ambush at will. The RUF never caught them. They barely saw them. Word spread through the rebel ranks with the speed of rumor and the weight of truth. The British were hunting commanders. No one was safe. The deep bush was no longer sanctuary. Fighters who had spent years believing they were untouchable began to desert. Some surrendered to UNAMSIL. Others simply disappeared into the civilian population. The most significant casualty of the British intervention was not a person, but an idea. The RUF had built their entire strategy on the assumption that the international community lacked the will to fight. That assumption had been the foundation of their power. The SAS shattered it in less time than it takes to plan most military operations. Foday Sankoh himself was captured on May 17th, not by the SAS, but by Sierra Leone army soldiers who had been emboldened by the British presence. He was found hiding in Freetown, trying to blend into the civilian population. The man who had terrorized a nation for 9 years was arrested without a shot being fired. He would die in custody 3 years later, awaiting trial for war crimes. The RUF, as a coherent fighting force, effectively ceased to exist following June 2000. Some fighters continued low-level operations for months afterward, but the command structure was broken. The supply lines were cut. The psychological dominance was gone. By January 2002, the Civil War was officially over. The final disarmament ceremonies saw thousands of former RUF fighters turn in their weapons under the supervision of UN peacekeepers and British-trained Sierra Leone army units. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. 9 years of civil war, 50,000 dead, 20,000 mutilated, hundreds of thousands displaced. The UN had deployed 9,000 peacekeepers and achieved little beyond their own humiliation. Britain deployed a fraction of that number, gave them the authority to act, and ended the war in a matter of weeks. The SAS lost one man during the entire Sierra Leone deployment. Trooper Brad Tinian was killed in September 2000 during a follow-on operation against the West Side Boys. He was 26 years old. His death hit the squadron hard, but it did not slow the mission. The regiment had lost men before. They would lose men again. That was the cost of doing what others could not. But Tinian's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of the thousands of Sierra Leoneans who suffered through 9 years of nightmare, bought something that was almost unimaginable in May 2000. Peace. Fragile, imperfect, and requiring years of effort to sustain. But peace nonetheless. The lessons from Sierra Leone spread through Western militaries with the speed of professional necessity. The operation became required study at Sandhurst, at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College, at officer training schools across NATO. What the SAS had demonstrated was not new tactics or revolutionary technology. They had demonstrated what happens when political leaders give military professionals clear objectives, the authority to act, and then step back and let them do their jobs. The United Nations learned, slowly and painfully, that peacekeeping without the will to enforce peace is worse than useless. It creates the illusion of international concern while doing nothing to stop the violence. The reforms that followed Sierra Leone, including the establishment of more robust rules of engagement for UN peacekeepers, came too late for the thousands who died. But they came. The British Army learned that small numbers of highly trained soldiers, properly employed, can achieve results that entire brigades of conventional forces cannot. The lessons influenced everything from equipment procurement to training doctrine, to the way special forces were integrated into wider military operations. Sierra Leone became the proof of concept for what would later be called the Tier 1 approach to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. For the people of Sierra Leone, the aftermath was complex and painful. The war ended, but the scars remained. The amputees still needed care. The orphans still needed homes. The psychological trauma of a generation that had known nothing but violence would take decades to heal. International aid poured in, as it always does. A feat of the crisis has passed and the cameras have moved on. Some of it helped. Much of it was wasted through corruption and incompetence. But by 2010, Sierra Leone had held multiple peaceful elections. The economy was growing. It was not paradise. It was not even fully recovered. But it was alive in a way that seemed impossible in May 2000. The SAS returned to their usual work: counter-terrorism rotations, training deployments, the endless cycle of operations that the public never hears about, because success in the regiment's world is measured by headlines that never get written. They did not seek recognition for Sierra Leone. The regiment has never sought recognition for anything. The work is its own reward. But within the wider military community, Sierra Leone became legend. The operation that ended a war in 6 hours, that is not quite accurate, of course. The war did not end in 6 hours. But the rescue of the Royal Irish Regiment on May 25th broke the RUF's will in a way that 9 years of conventional operations had not. Everything that followed was consequence and cleanup. The deeper truth, the one that makes Sierra Leone worth studying 20 years later, is what it reveals about the gap between military capability and political will. The tools to end the RUF's reign of terror existed in 1995, in 1997, in 1990. What did not exist was the willingness to use them. The international community preferred half measures, negotiations with men who had no intention of negotiating in good faith, and peacekeeping missions designed to avoid casualties rather than prevent atrocities. It took 11 British soldiers being taken hostage to cut through that paralysis. It took the SAS kicking indoors in Masiaka and dragging their own people out at gunpoint to demonstrate what was possible when someone finally decided to act. That is the lesson Sierra Leone teaches, and it is not a comfortable one. Sometimes the only thing that stops violence is greater violence applied with surgical precision by men who know what they are doing. Sometimes diplomacy is a luxury that gets people killed while diplomats debate. Sometimes the only moral action is the one that ends the suffering, regardless of how it looks in a UN resolution. The men of D Squadron who flew into Lungi Airport in May 2000 did not go there to end a civil war. They went there to protect British civilians and bring their captured comrades home. But in doing those things, they accomplished what 9,000 peacekeepers and 9 years of international hand-wringing could not. They proved that evil, when confronted by competence and will, collapses faster than anyone believes possible. And perhaps that is the truest thing Sierra Leone can teach us. The monsters who prey on the weak do so because they believe no one will stop them. They build their power on that belief. They sustain their terror through the international community's endless capacity for inaction, dressed up as process. The SAS stopped them in 6 hours, not because they were superhuman, not because they had magical technology, because they were given a mission, the authority to complete it, and they did what they had trained their entire careers to do. The rough learned, too late to save themselves, what soldiers have known since warfare began. There are men in this world who will not negotiate, will not debate, will not hesitate. Men who will come through the door at 0600 with weapons loaded and a clarity of purpose that no amount of bluster or terror can withstand. Those men were not there to make a point or send a message. They were there to get their people back. Everything else was just consequence.